Hello. I'm Sally, your host. Welcome to the third board, my master's chess channel. In this video, we will show you the conclusion of the game played between the Czech Grandmaster Oldrich Duras and the Cuban Grandmaster José Raul Capablanca in 1913. If you have not watched part 1, I recommend you watch it first. Just click the link above. So, let's continue the game. In this position, Oldrich Duras played Rook a7. And so we come to a rook ending, with advantage of one pawn for black, and all pawns in the king side. Capablanca's plan is simple. He will try to separate the white pawns, and create a passed pawn, probably the king's file pawn. At the same time, he will try to advance the black king to support the pawns. Let's now see how he executes this plan. The game continues with pawn to h5, g3, h4. Capablanca advances the pawn to h4 to prevent Duras from advancing his pawn to that square. If black played g5, the game could have continued with rook a5, attacking the g5 pawn, f6, defending the pawn, and rook a7, cutting off black's king. Back to the game. After black's h4, Duras plays g takes on h4. According to Stockfish, this is the best response for white. If white were to advance the pawn to g4, to avoid isolated pawns, the game could have continued. Rook b5, f4, rook b3, king to g2, rook g3 check, king h2, rook f3, rook a4, f5. And black would be better. Back to the game. After white's g takes on h4, the game continues with rook takes on h4, king g2, e5, king g3, rook d4. This move allows white to move the pawn to h4, but it is considered the best move in this position. Continuing the game. Rook a5, attacking the e5 pawn, f6, defending the pawn, rook a7, preventing the black's king advance through f7, king g8. The black king is forced to take the long way in order to support his pawns. Rook b7, king h7, rook a7, king g6, rook e7, rook d3 check. And now we arrived at another interesting position of the game. How will Duras defend against this check? There are 4 moves that deserve attention. Duras can advance the king to h4. He can advance the king to g4. He can retreat the king to g2. Or he can move the pawn to f3, blocking the check. What do you think is white's best move? What would you do if you were Duras? If you wish, pause the video, study the lines, and try to find the best move in this position. If white plays king h4, black would play rook f3 and win a pawn. If white plays king g4, the game would continue with f5 check, king h4, king f6, Rook a7, g5 check, king h5, and rook takes pawn, mate. If white plays pawn to f3, the game would continue with king f5, rook takes on g7, e4, h4, rook takes on f3 check, and Capablanca would have two connected passed pawns, which would ensure victory. So, after rook's d3 check, Duras is forced to move his king back to g2. Back to the game. Capablanca plays rook d5, protecting the king file pawn, in order to advance the bishop file pawn. King f3, f5, rook a7, rook d3 check, king g2, e4, rook a4. According to Stockfish, moving the rook to a4 was a mistake. It was better for white to play h4, to stop black's king from advancing. After that, the game could have continued with rook d2, king g3, rook d1, rook a6 check, king h5, rook a7, king h6, rook a6 check, g6, rook a8, rook g1 check, king h2, rook g4. And white would still be worse, but in a better position than the game. Back to the game. Capablanca plays king g5. The king goes up. Rook a5, g6, rook b5, king f4, rook a5, rook d2, rook a4, temporarily preventing the king's file pawn from advancing. g5, rook b4, king e5. Black threatens to play e3, attacking the pinned f2 pawn. Rook b5 check, rook d5, rook b8, avoiding the exchange of rooks. f4, rook g8, king d4, king f1, preventing black's king from advancing to e2 through d3. King d3. Black also prevents white's king from occupying the e2 square. Rook a8, e3. Capablanca plays pawn to e3, aware that the white rook can check him at a3. But he has already calculated the consequences of that check. His intention is to advance the bishop file pawn to f3. Also, note that from now on, black not only advances his pawns, but also makes mate threats to white's king. Duras plays rook a3 check. If white took the e3 pawn, we could have the following continuation. King takes on e3. Rook a3 check. Here, if Duras plays rook e8 check, Capablanca would play king f3 and then king g3, winning the game. After rook a3 check, we could have rook d3, rook a2, f3. Here, black cannot play rook d1 check, as the game could continue with king g2, rook d2 check, rook takes on d2, king takes on d2, and king f3, followed by h4, drawing the game. Continuing this line, after black's f3, we could have rook a1, rook d4, And after that, black could play king f4, and king g3, winning the game. Back to the game. After rook a3 check, we have king e4, f takes on e3, f3. This is the position Capablanca predicted when he advanced the pawn to e3, 2 moves ago. Advancing the pawn to f3 is a better move than taking the e3 pawn with the f4 pawn. Back to the game. Duras plays king g1. The white king cannot leave the first rank, or can be mated. For example, if Duras played king f2, the game could have continued with rook d2 check, king g3, and rook g2 mate. Back to the game. After king g1, black plays rook d3. And here, we come to another interesting position in the game. What will white play next? There are 3 moves we should consider. White can move his rook to a5. He can play rook a8. And he can exchange rooks, playing rook takes on d3. What do you think is white's best move, and also the one chosen by Duras? What would you do if you were Duras? If you wish, pause the video, study the lines, and try to find the best move in this position. If white plays rook a5, the game would continue with king takes on e3, rook e5 check. Here, capturing the g5 pawn would precipitate defeat. Black would continue with rook d1 check, and the game would be lost. Let's continue the line. King f4, rook a5, g4, rook a4 check, king e3, rook a1, g3, and black would win. If white exchange rooks on d3, this would not help either. The game would continue like this. King takes on d3, king f2, king e4, king f1, king takes on e3, king g1, f2 check, king f1, king f3, h4, g4, h5, g3, h6, and g2, mate. Back to the game. Duras plays rook a8. And the game continues. King takes on e3. Rook e8 check. King f4. Rook g8. Rook d1 check. King f2. Rook d2 check. King f1. If instead of king f1, Duras played king g1, the game would have continued with rook g2 check, king h1, g4, and black would have won. After king f1, Capablanca plays rook h2, king g1. If instead of king g1, white played rook h8, black would have played king g3, threatening mate. The game continues with rook takes on h3, rook g7, g4, rook g8, king g3. And in this position, Oldrich Duras resigned. Did you like this game? It was a long video, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you want notifications of more content like this, please subscribe to this channel. My master and I wish good luck in your chess. Thank you, and see you again. Goodbye.